So we are on our last week of a series we've been calling God Leading, and over the past 8 weeks we've been going through different parts of the story of Abraham and looking at how God has led Abraham from this point here to this point. And we've looked at how Abraham and his family and the people that followed him have responded. And we've seen that sometimes Abraham's decisions have been spot on, they've been right on the mark, and God has blessed them. But then we've also seen times where Abraham or Sarah don't always make the best choices, and God continues to work through those. We've talked a lot about how God is a God who fulfills and honors the promises that He makes. And we've looked at things, we've looked at the themes of obedience and discerning God's will. And so today we're going to continue in this discussion, and we're going to talk about a few more themes, and we're going to wrap this story up. But I want to start with an opening reflection, and I need you to use your imagination, if you will. So imagine that you have passed away, and God has given you the gift of witnessing your funeral. Who is there? What is the mood of that event? What are the people saying about you? Now, for many of us, many of you may just think this is a really morbid thought. But for me, it's a powerful reflection because it helps me to look toward the future, to see, have I lived a good life? Will people there be saying positive things about me, or will they be saying, thank God he's gone? All right? Well, what's the mood? And I haven't been a pastor a long time, and I'm sure Ben and David can speak to this at length, but there's two almost diametrically opposed funerals. There are those funerals that people are joyous, that it's literally a celebration of life, that we honor and cherish the life that has gone on before us, and we are thankful for the influence that person has had on our lives. But then there's also those situations in which there's immense family conflict, where there's hurt that go on, and those settings can be very, very uncomfortable. Okay? And sometimes the words that are said are not so kind and loving and nice. And so this question leads us into one of our main topics today, which is the idea of legacy. And that is, how will people remember us as a person? How will people remember our church after our time has come and gone? So I want you to keep that reflection in the back of your mind this morning as we go through portions of chapter 21 and 22 in the book of Genesis, and finish up with our story of Abraham. So we'll start right away with chapter 21, and it says, Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, and at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son that Sarah bore him, and when he was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. And so, folks, for those of you that have been here the last 8 weeks and been following along, we've looked at how the story of Abraham has drawn up in this dramatic arc, if you will, to this very point. That we've seen from the beginning that God had given Abraham and Sarah, Abram and Sarai at the time, 3 promises. That if they would leave their land, if they would leave their family and all of their things and go to this place that God was calling him, that God would make Abraham's name great, that he would give Abraham this land, and that he would give Abraham a son. And in many ways, 2 of those promises have been fulfilled. We've seen God take Abraham out of his homeland and bring him to the promised land. And we've seen that God has been making Abraham's name great. We've seen Abraham interact with kings and with cities and with powerful people. He has a following and that gives him military strength, and he's able to go to war with some of these very powerful figures. Okay? We've also watched as Abraham's view of the promises has changed, and how Abraham now has developed a caring capacity not only for his people, the people that he believed will be the people of promise, but also for all of God's creation. And so today we look at the fulfillment of the final promise, this sort of climactic ending. Okay? And so the Lord was gracious to Sarah, just as he said, and did exactly what he said he was going to do at the very time that he said he was going to do it. And so, folks, again, just a reiteration that God fulfills promises, that God is a God of his word, and that when we read in Scripture the promises that are in there, as long as they're general, that, again, we can claim the power of those promises, we can use those in prayer, and that there's power, and that we can know for certain that God will fulfill those. Now, the other important thing that we need to remember is that God has a timing, and that timing isn't always the same as ours. Okay? I don't know how many times in my life I have felt God say, you know, Josh, I think I need you to go here and do this thing, and I just run and do it as fast as I can, and then all of a sudden I feel like I'm bumping my head into a wall because God has just not opened those doorways for that to be completed yet. And I constantly get this call, Josh, you got to slow down. Josh, you got to do this. You got to go slower. I need you to go through this process. I need to make you into something else before this thing can be completed. And folks, I suspect many of you have felt that same kind of tension in your own lives as you feel called to do certain things, and yet it's not always open. You know, sometimes we pray for healing and it doesn't seem to come. We pray for things in our lives to happen and they don't happen as we think they should look or in the timing that we desire, but that doesn't diminish God's power and authority over the things that he has. And so as you listen to the first two worship songs that we had this morning, much of them spoke of God's time, of God's creation, of this sense of eternity that is in God's hands. And so, folks, even though we have this small, finite brain, I often like to call my brain a little pea brain compared to God's infinite brain. And we need to remember that even though things don't always go as we foresee, that God is indeed in control. We also need to think in terms of priority, and I like the picture representation because in this American culture, our mind buys with so many other things for time. Okay? We're constantly bombarded with all of these things we want to do, and it's interesting how many people are now almost afraid or nervous in a setting where things are just quiet and they actually have nothing to do. Any of you ever been there? Where you just kind of get this spot and you almost feel uncomfortable? I got to turn on the radio, I need some distraction. Oh, I got to go do this thing because I just got to be busy because I just don't know what to do with myself anymore. And so, folks, we need to think about that aspect as well. And again, be discerning God's will for us as we move forward. Now, as we go a little bit further in chapter 21, we get kind of this really beautiful picture of Sarah, and she says, you know what, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham and Sarah that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Okay, and so I don't know about you, I just envision Sarah kind of holding this brand new baby child, just being in this very joyous celebration. That at the age of 90, she finally has this gift, this dream that she's waited her whole life to see. And she's kind of able to laugh, not only at the situation, but perhaps even laugh at herself. Because we know Sarah's path hasn't always been clear. Again, she's been one that struggled with God's timing. We know that for the ancient people, that to have a child and to have a son was one of the most important things in their entire life, because it meant that the family name, the family line would continue on through that son. And so we've looked at how this tension and the anxiety around Abraham and Sarah not having a child. You know, at one point, Abraham kind of complains to God, saying, you know what, my descendant in Damascus is going to get all of my inheritance. You promised me this son, where is it? And Sarah, too, takes matters into her own hand and says, well, God promised we were going to have a son, but I just can't have kids, so why don't you go and have a relationship with one of my slaves and have a son through her, and then we'll fulfill that promise. But God constantly said, no, that's not my time. That's not my desire. My desire is for you to have a child, and I will give you one. And last week we looked at these 3 visitors that came down and visited Abraham, and they said, you know what, by this time next year, you'll have a child. And look what happens. Fulfilling to the day that God needed that to happen, it happens. And so, folks, I think we need to observe Sarah's model a little bit, and we need to be a little bit lighter with ourselves. We need to dig into our sense of humor a little bit. All right? You know, there's times that I look back over my life and I just laugh and say, wow, that was a really fun time. Those were great people, though. That was a great time. And then there's, like Sarah, I believe in this one too, where I just kind of shake my head and nervously laugh and say, man, it's amazing that I'm still alive today with some of the dumb things that I've done in my life. All right? But again, we need to be able to laugh at ourselves a little bit. Okay? We'll find that things go much smoother in our lives when we have a little bit of sense of humor in our lives rather than being offended at every little thing that people say. And so I invite you to consider that as we go forward. Now, as I say that and talk about bringing a sense of humor in, we find that Sarah's mood changes a little bit in the following verses. And so Abraham has grown a little bit, and he's having some interaction with Ishmael, who is the son of Abraham and Hagar, Sarah's slave. And Sarah gets pretty mad. I suspect that there's some jealousy going on here because she may be regretting the decision to have allowed that relationship to happen. She may have some fear going on that Ishmael will perhaps take some of the inheritance that belongs to her son that God has promised. And so she asked Abraham to send Ishmael and Hagar away. Okay? And so think about some of the family dynamics that we have in our own lives. And how do we deal with those? How do we work through some of those issues? And again, to me, it comes down to discerning what God is telling us. You know, oftentimes we can make real rash or irrational decisions based on our reaction to an event that happens. And yet, what does Abraham do here? Abraham consults God before he does anything. He doesn't just say, you know what, Sarah, I can see you're really upset. Yep, you're right, we're getting rid of him. No, he comes to God and he consults God, and God says, you know what, it's okay to let them go. I will bless Ishmael just as I said I would, but it's okay to let her go. Let him and her go. And so that's what happens. And so we find that Abraham packs them up and he sends them off on their ways with some provision. And again, the promise that Isaac is the one who will have this blessing. But he also says that I will bless Ishmael in a similar way. So folks, I know that for those of you that have been aware, we've been talking about moving into a stage of church growth, and we've been starting to do some planning. We're going to be in the process of doing some visioning and goal setting here soon. And I know that for some of you, that may cause a little bit of anxiety. That may cause a little bit of nervousness. I also know that as we go forward, there are going to be some decisions that are made that not everyone is going to be happy with. And so what will be our family dynamics? Okay? My hope is that it doesn't come down to you deciding to leave like Ishmael and Hagar do because you don't think you can live with where we're going. But I do believe God has a plan for us, that God is setting us on a course to go and do these things, and we need to walk through that obediently. Okay? And so let us be prayerful. Let us come together in the ways as we walk through this. Let us share in the successes and celebrate those successes, but at the same time, let us remain humble. Let us be quick to forgive and ask forgiveness if we make mistakes as we go along. Because as shown in the scriptures above, even though God continues to work through each and every situation, regardless of our decisions, God doesn't always remove the consequences of those decisions and actions that we have. I included these verses because I think it's very important to understand that God just cares about people. And again, even though he permits Abraham to send Ishmael and Hagar off, God still watches over the two of them. And so as you read the story a little bit further, you find that Hagar and Ishmael run out of provision. There's great distress. Hagar literally thinks their child is going to die, and God sends an angel down to them and says, don't fear. God has given your son a promise, and we will honor that. And so he does. He cares for Ishmael, and Ishmael goes on to be a leader or the founder of a tribe of 12 princes. And this nation continues to show up throughout the Old Testament scriptures over and over again. All right? If you know anything about the religion of Islam, you know that Ishmael goes on to be a descendant of Muhammad, the major religious figure in Islam. So again, God blesses him in a way that is unique. Okay? Now we're going to skip the rest of chapter 21, and we're going to go into what I consider to be a very difficult chapter in our scriptures again, and this is the call of Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Okay? And so in 22:2 we see that God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain that I will show you." All right? So now, for the last 7 or 8 chapters of this story, we've been leading up to this climax of Abraham having a son, or Abraham and Sarah having a son. And it's not even a half a chapter later that God says, "You know what? I need you to go sacrifice this son on this mountain." All right? Now, I don't know about you, but being a father, the very thought of having to sacrifice one of my own kids just kind of makes me want to turn and run the other way. Now, there are some days that I consider it. I don't know that I could really go through with it. All right? But I just, to read this story just almost creates a pit in my stomach as I think about this. Like, what? How must Abraham have felt to get this call? To have waited 100 years to have this son that he's desired so much, and then have God ask him to do this thing. Okay? And now many of you can go to a very hypothetical or theoretical abstract view and say, well, how can a good God even ask someone to do this? But again, I would say you need to read the rest of the story. Look at how the story ends. All right? And so this becomes an ultimate test for Abraham in his faith. And I think this story really is a precursor or a shadow of what is to come. And so as we read the rest of this story, we see that Abraham takes and he loads this burden of wood on his son Isaac, and they begin taking this trek up this mountain. All right? But who does this story really remind you of? Because isn't it Jesus that does that same thing? Doesn't God say, you know what, Jesus, I need you to take the burden of the world. I need you to take the sin of humanity and place that on your shoulders. I need you to carry that cross, bloody and battered, up that hill. You, my son, my only son, Jesus. Isn't this the same thing? And again, I wonder what Abraham says as he's walking up that hill, knowing that his son doesn't know. I suspect Abraham didn't tell anyone else what God had led him to do, and I imagine his stomach just churning. And Isaac gets to a point where he asks, "Dad, we have all this stuff for the sacrifice, but we have no animal." And Abraham says, "You know what? God will provide." And think of that statement, how hard that must be. Again, knowing that he knows that Isaac is to be the sacrifice, but also clinging to that hope that God will indeed lift this from him so that he doesn't have to go through with it. And Abraham goes through the full intention, literally laying his son on this altar and raising the knife before the angel of the Lord says, Abraham, stop, stop. You did what you were supposed to. But isn't it funny that God, it's not funny, but God didn't stop. God allowed his son to be placed on that altar for us, to be crucified, to be that lamb for us, that sacrificial lamb, so that we could be restored to right relationship with him. Now, a little bit of interesting trivia for you. There are some scholars who believe that in many ways the land which Abraham is called to, this land of Moriah, they believe that those very mountains might be the very mountains of Jerusalem, that later become Jerusalem in the very place that Jesus was crucified. So we don't know that for sure, but it would be an interesting correlation if that was indeed the story. And so we have a perfection of faith. We see Abraham pass this test. And I just imagine him kind of wiping the sweat from his brow as God intervenes and says, you know what, don't go through with it. And he sees this ram over in this thicket, and they're able to go and sacrifice. And I imagine him just clinging to his son and sharing in that worship experience. And so, folks, I don't think God will ever ask us to sacrifice our children, but he will ask us to make sacrifices with our lives. And one of the lies that I think permeates the church and our culture right now is that if you become a Christian, then everything in your life is just going to be all perfect and fun and whatever else, and God's just always going to bless you with this abundance. And there's truth in some of those claims, but God also calls us to sacrifice. All right? Look at the sacrifice of many of God's people. Look at the trials that they had to go through. Almost every one of the disciples and apostles dies a very gruesome death because of their love for Jesus and their willingness to proclaim the gospel. And folks, I will say that in many ways we're starting to see a reduction in our religious liberties. I believe there's an attack on our religious liberties, and there may come a time that we have to begin to sacrifice some big things in order to continue to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And are we going to be willing to do that? Are we going to be able to walk the hard road, to put those things that we value most on that altar and say, you know what, I really don't want to do this, God, but if this is what you call me to do, I'll sacrifice this thing for you. I'll sacrifice myself for where you call me to go. And so we end today in the same place that we started, again, talking about the idea of legacy. And friends, as we end the story of Abraham, we know that only there's a couple more chapters that go on, and we find that Abraham passes away. All right? And yet here we are some 3,000 to 5,000 years later, still reading the stories about Abraham and his acts of faith and the things that he did. We have his legacy, so that, think about that, 5,000 years old, through oral tradition, through the writing down of the scriptures carried on and put into this book that we call the Bible, so that we continue to read and hear about that our lives may be changed by his story, by his example. So what's our legacy? What's your legacy as a person? What are those people going to say about you when your time has come? Now, I want us to be careful, because the idea of legacy can be a really slippery slope, because we can become very much just focused on us as an individual, but I want us to keep this in the context of what God is doing in our lives, not just us chasing off after what we desire. But what will be our legacy? What will be mine? What will be our church legacy? This church has existed for 100 plus years. How many more years will it continue? If it ceases to exist, what will this town, what will this community remember? What will it say? Will the ministries that are started today continue on for 3 years, 30 years, 300 years? What will it look like? And friends, we do need to remember that we are part of God's story, and that God has an eternal legacy. As as the songs we sang already this morning talk about, we see God's legacy through the creation, that God created with his hands, and that we see that each and every day of our lives. We read the scriptures and we see about God's work of redemption throughout every single one of the scriptures. Now, this last week in our prayer group, someone read a story about how valuable our time is. And they said, when we compare things like precious jewels or precious resources, oftentimes those items become more valuable when there's a limited supply of them. So the smaller amount that there is, the more value that they have. And then the author correlated that to our time, and he said, how valuable is your time? And he said, just imagine that your lifespan is 100 years. And right now, for many of us, that seems like a long time. But think about the span of eternity. All right? That big mark that you think looks so big right now becomes just this tiny little blip on the timeline of God's eternal plan. And so, folks, your time, your life is something extremely valuable. It's priceless. It's beyond measure. And each of us has something important to do with our life. And I told you last week, I don't care if you're older in dirt and your hair is as white as snow, or you don't have any hair anymore, or if you're one of our newest infants, that God has a calling and a plan for your life, and that you are never too old or too young to be used by God in some special way. So think about your legacy. And I want to end with this, because this is one of my favorite stories. Those of you that know me know that I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. And so this scene is from the third movie in Lord of the Rings, and I don't know if you can see it very well because of the light coming in, but right in the center, there's these four little guys standing right there, and those are the hobbits of Tolkien's story, okay? And one of the things I appreciate so much about Tolkien's work is that there's some amazing characters that are developed throughout his book. You've got Gandalf, this great wizard who's this wise sage who has these awesome magical powers. You've got an elven prince who is just an archer beyond belief and agile and can do all of these things. You've got a king or a ranger who has to fight through some of his demons, who eventually becomes king. But then you've got these four little guys, these four little hobbits that everybody writes off. They're just these run-of-the-mill little characters, very much what I would envision many of us in these small communities. They're just down to earth. They care about farming and the things of the earth. They care about their little communities. And they're just kind of, in many ways, oblivious to the larger world that exists beyond them. And yet these four little creatures exhibit amazing heroism. They go above and beyond anything that's expected of them from the other races in this book. And this is a climax of the story where, again in the movies, where Aragorn is crowned king and he comes before them and they seek to bow before this newly anointed king. And the king says, my friends, you bow before no one. Because of their sacrifice, because of the things that they did, and that they would be remembered. That again, Tolkien's success of the story is that these little average hobbits that no one seems to even know exist or that anyone cares about literally changed the world in that story forever. And so, folks, I say that, again, you never know how you might change the world for one person, 100 people, 1,000 people, or more. So never take for granted the power that God has given you to make a difference. All right? So let me end with some action steps for you this morning. Pray and reflect on how God is leading you personally and the church. And are there 1 to 2 practical things that you can identify and do this week in either of those areas of your lives? Now, going along with our opening reflection, I would encourage you this week to write out your obituary. And again, I know this sounds very morbid. I'm not really interested in how you die. Hopefully you die doing what you love, or like me, you just hope you die in your sleep. All right, that's not of really any importance to me. But again, reflect on those areas of who's there, what's being said, how are you remembered for years to come. Think of what you want your legacy to be. And I can tell you that I've done this 2 or 3 times, and it's changed each and every time that I've done it. The first time, I was in a spot where I was just really kind of focused on myself and doing what I wanted to do, and I just envisioned my funeral just being really small, just being intimate friends and family, and it was a good little funeral, okay? When I did it again, I was in a much different space and really felt God called me and say, you know what, Josh, you're capable of so much more. And so that little funeral of 25 or 50 people turned into hundreds and thousands of people talking about the influence that I had had on their lives. Okay, now this is just a creative exercise. It doesn't mean it's the truth. But again, for me, God spoke through me through that exercise, and it was a call to say, you know what, I have more in store for you. So I invite you to think about that from that perspective in doing that exercise. Next, as we continue to go through our visioning and goal setting as a church, what will our church legacy be? What will our communities in the world say about us after we're gone? Or perhaps even after this church is gone. And then friends, in the midst of all of our busyness, take some time for some self-care this week. I invite you to tap into God's abundant and overflowing power and just be filled. God bless.